The clock on James Morrison's dashboard read 11:42 p.m. as he guided his black Audi through the quiet streets of Georgetown. The amber glow of streetlights cast long shadows across the historic brick buildings, their windows dark except for the occasional student burning the midnight oil. As FBI director, late nights were more rule than exception, but tonight's marathon budget meeting had been particularly draining. His mind wandered to the stack of civil rights cases crowding his desk. Just that morning, he'd reviewed footage from a police shooting in Milwaukee that left a 17-year-old dead and a community in turmoil. The incident report painted one picture, the body cam footage another entirely. Morrison had spent decades in law enforcement, and these disparities troubled him more with each passing year. "We have to do better," he muttered to himself, adjusting his tie. The Bureau's new training initiatives were promising, but changing institutional culture was like steering an aircraft carrier, slow, deliberate, and requiring constant course corrections. The flash of blue lights in his rearview mirror pulled him from his thoughts. Morrison glanced at his speedometer, 32 in a 35 zone. He eased the Audi toward the curb, muscle memory from his early days as a field agent guiding his movements. Right turn signal, slow and smooth, far enough off the road to give the officer a safety margin. 20 yards back, Officer Ryan Cooper ran the plate through his system. No hits, no warrants, just a clean late-model Audi registered to a James Morrison. Cooper had been on edge all week. 3 carjackings in the district, all involving high-end vehicles, all perpetrated by suspects who initially appeared non-threatening. His sergeant's words echoed in his head, "Stay frosty. These guys are getting bold." Cooper approached the vehicle, flashlight beam cutting through the tinted rear window. The driver sat perfectly still, hands on the wheel almost too perfectly still. Cooper's right hand instinctively brushed his holster. "License and registration," he barked, keeping his distance from the window. "Of course," Officer Morrison replied calmly. "I'm going to reach for my credentials in my inside jacket pocket. I should inform you that I'm the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Cooper's pulse quickened. In his 3 years on the force, he'd heard every excuse imaginable. FBI director. That was a new one. The carjacking crew had been using increasingly sophisticated tactics, sometimes claiming to be federal agents. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Cooper commanded, his voice sharper now, both hands on the wheel. Morrison complied, but continued speaking in measured tones. "Officer, my credentials are right here in my jacket. I'm happy to show them to you, but I want to be clear about my movements." Cooper's mind raced through his training scenarios. The driver was too calm, too controlled. The high-end car, the professional demeanor, the federal agent claim it all fit the pattern of the recent carjackings. Only these weren't usually one-man operations. "Exit the vehicle slowly, hands where I can see them." Inside the car, Morrison recognized the fear creeping into the young officer's voice. He'd trained enough agents to know that fear was law enforcement's deadliest enemy, more dangerous than any weapon. Fear led to poor decisions, escalated situations, turned routine stops into tragedies. As Morrison began to comply, Cooper caught the glint of metal beneath the driver's jacket, a shoulder holster. His weapon cleared its holster in one fluid motion. "Gun. Hands up. On your knees now." Morrison froze, hands raised above his head, FBI credentials forgotten in his jacket pocket. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here he was, the nation's top law enforcement officer, facing down the barrel of a local cop's service weapon. If he survived this, it would make one hell of a training scenario. "Officer, I'm going to comply with your commands, but I want to be very clear I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My credentials are in my left breast pocket. There are about to be a lot of very concerned federal agents heading this way." Cooper's flashlight beam illuminated Morrison's face, and for the first time, doubt crept in. The man looked familiar, but in the adrenaline haze of the moment, Cooper couldn't place him. His finger remained on the trigger, years of training warring with the growing suspicion that he'd made a terrible mistake. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Morrison's security detail, never far behind, had noticed the stop. Standard procedure would have them running his vehicle's location the moment he deviated from his usual route. They would have seen the traffic stop. They would be calling it in. Last warning. "On your knees, hands behind your head." Morrison slowly sank to his knees, the the rough pavement of Georgetown's historic streets pressing through his tailored suit pants. In his mind, he was already composing the memo that would revolutionize traffic stop procedures across federal law enforcement. If he lived through this, things would change. They had to change. Red and blue lights began to strobe off the surrounding buildings as backup units approached. Among them would be Morrison's security detail, and this young officer's world was about to turn upside down. In that moment, Morrison felt an odd mix of anger and pity. The system had failed them both, him by putting him in this position, and Officer Cooper by inadequately preparing him for the complexities of modern policing. The next few seconds would reshape both their lives, spark nationwide protests, and force a long overdue conversation about police training and accountability. But for now, there was just the cool night air, the harsh glare of flashlight beams, and two men caught in a moment that exemplified everything wrong with American law enforcement. Cooper's radio crackled to life. All units, be advised. Subject vehicle is registered to FBI Director James Morrison. Approach with caution. Federal response incoming. The young officer's face went pale as reality crashed in. His weapon remained trained on the kneeling figure before him, but his hands had begun to shake. In the distance, the wail of sirens grew louder, heralding the arrival of a storm that would change American law enforcement forever. The Georgetown street had become an arena of flashing lights and rising tension. FBI Director James Morrison remained on his knees, hands clasped behind his head, watching Officer Ryan Cooper's internal struggle play out behind the wavering barrel of his service weapon. The night air hung heavy with the scent of rubber and exhaust as more patrol cars screeched to a halt around them. Officer Morrison spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of decades in law enforcement. "I want you to understand that whatever happens next, I know you're doing your job. But right now, you need to take a breath and think very carefully about your next move." Cooper's hands trembled slightly, his flashlight beam dancing across Morrison's expensive suit. The radio traffic had confirmed that this was indeed the FBI director. But training and adrenaline kept his weapon raised, his mind racing through procedures that suddenly seemed inadequate for this situation. I need to see credentials," Cooper managed, his voice cracking slightly. Slowly. Very slowly. "Of course," Morrison replied, his tone remaining measured. "I'm going to lower my right hand, reach into my left breast pocket, and retrieve my FBI credentials. Every movement will be deliberate and announced." From her approaching vehicle, Captain Sarah Chen recognized the gravity of the situation immediately. She'd seen the FBI director speak at last month's law enforcement conference. Her heart sank as she processed the scene before her. One of her officers, weapon drawn on the nation's top law enforcement official. "All units hold position," she barked into her radio. "Cooper, stand down. That's the FBI director." Morrison's security detail arrived simultaneously, their black SUVs boxing in the scene. Senior Agent Teresa Martinez emerged, her weapon at the ready, face tight with controlled fury. "FBI, lower your weapon immediately." "Director Morrison, are you all right?" The street had become a powder keg. Local officers, FBI agents, and Morrison's security detail created a ring of drawn weapons and competing jurisdictions. One wrong move, one nervous trigger finger, and this would become a tragedy of historic proportions. Morrison, still kneeling, remained the eye of this law enforcement hurricane. "Everyone take a breath," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Agent Martinez, stand down. Captain Chen, please have your officers lower their weapons. Officer Cooper and I are going to resolve this situation professionally." Slowly, deliberately, Morrison retrieved his credentials, holding them open for Cooper to see. The young officer's face drained of color as he stared at the official FBI identification, reality crashing in like a tidal wave. "Oh God," Cooper whispered, finally lowering his weapon. "Oh God, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, sir." Morrison rose carefully, brushing off his knees. "Secure your weapon, son. Then we're all going to take a step back and handle this correctly." The next hour was a blur of incident reports, phone calls, and gathering media presence. News vans began arriving before Cooper had even holstered his weapon, their satellite dishes rising like mechanical flowers in the Georgetown night. Captain Chen took control of the scene, ordering a perimeter established to keep the growing crowd of onlookers and reporters at bay. Morrison's security detail hovered anxiously, clearly unhappy about the entire situation but following their principal's lead. Cooper sat in his patrol car, head in his hands, as his sergeant read him his rights. The young officer's career flashed before his eyes: 3 years of service, a clean record until now, all potentially destroyed in a single traffic stop. Morrison surprised everyone by approaching Cooper's car. His security detail moved to intercept, but he waved them off. Officer Cooper, Morrison said, leaning down to the window, "I want you to listen carefully. What happened here tonight isn't just about you or me. It's about a system that needs fixing. You're going to face consequences for your actions, but how you handle what comes next matters just as much as what happened here." Cooper looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "Sir, I don't know what to say. I thought with the recent carjackings." "I know exactly what you thought," Morrison interrupted. "That's precisely the problem we need to address. Now, you're about to face a storm like you've never seen. My advice? Be honest. Be accountable. And be ready to learn from this." The media coverage began before the scene was even cleared. Smartphone videos from nearby residents were already circulating on social media. The headlines wrote themselves: "FBI Director Held at Gunpoint by Local Police." "Traffic Stop Gone Wrong, Nation's Top Cop Faces Down Barrel of Police Weapon, Georgetown Incident Highlights Law Enforcement Crisis." By midnight, news helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights turning the historic neighborhood into an impromptu stage. National news networks interrupted their programming for live coverage. Political pundits scrambled to their studios, ready to debate the implications of a police officer drawing his weapon on the FBI director. CNN's coverage led with the irony in a stunning development. The man responsible for training federal law enforcement nationwide found himself facing the very issues he's been working to address. MSNBC focused on the racial implications, while Fox News questioned whether Morrison's security detail had followed proper procedures. Social media exploded with competing narratives. Hashtags trended: Georgetown standoff, blue on blue, policing the police. Video clips from various angles showed Morrison on his knees, Cooper's drawn weapon, the arrival of backup. Each new angle fueled fresh outrage and debate. At the FBI headquarters, phones began ringing off the hook. The Attorney General wanted briefing materials. The White House needed talking points. Police unions across the country prepared statements. Civil rights organizations mobilized their response teams. Morrison stood with Captain Chen, watching the circus unfold. "This isn't going to be simple to fix," he said quietly. "No," Sir Chen replied, her eyes on Cooper being escorted to an internal affairs vehicle. "But maybe it needed to happen. Maybe it took the FBI director being held at gunpoint for people to understand what we're dealing with." Maybe Morrison agreed, but let's make sure we learn the right lessons from this. That young man isn't a monster. He's a product of a system that needs serious reform. As the night wore on, the incident became a symbol of police training deficiencies, of racial profiling, of the complex relationship between federal and local law enforcement. But for the two men at the center of it all, it was painfully personal. Morrison finally left the scene at 2 a.m. after giving a brief statement to Internal Affairs. His security detail insisted on driving, his own vehicle now part of the investigation. As they pulled away, he watched Officer Cooper being led out of the precinct building, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing like artillery fire. Tomorrow, the real storm would begin. Congressional inquiries would be launched. Police procedures would be scrutinized. Careers would end. But perhaps, Morrison thought, something good could come from this night. Perhaps this was the wake-up call American law enforcement needed. His phone buzzed the Attorney General. Again, the news had reached the West Coast. Soon the morning shows would begin their coverage. The incident would be dissected, analyzed, debated. But only 2 people truly knew what had transpired in those tense moments: a young officer who made a terrible mistake, and the FBI director who recognized in that mistake the failures of an entire system. The Internal Affairs conference room felt smaller than usual as Detective Sarah Martinez spread the contents of Officer Ryan Cooper's personnel file across the table. 5 years of service, evaluations, civilian complaints, and body camera footage lay before her like pieces of a puzzle she wished she didn't have to solve. "Play it again," she instructed the tech specialist. The footage from the Georgetown incident filled the wall-mounted screen, frame by frame, each moment dissected with clinical precision. What the investigation revealed went beyond a single traffic stop gone wrong. Cooper's file painted a pattern that had somehow slipped through the cracks. 12 civilian complaints in 3 years, all dismissed. Traffic stops disproportionately targeting minorities. Body camera footage showing a consistent pattern of escalation. "How did we miss this?" Captain Chen muttered, reviewing the statistics. The numbers were damning. Cooper's stop and search rate for minorities was triple the department average. Meanwhile, across town, FBI Director Morrison faced his own challenges. Congressional leaders demanded action. Police unions sought his support for Cooper. Civil rights organizations pressed for systemic reform. Every morning brought fresh headlines and heated debates. "You're in a unique position," Attorney General Richardson told him during their daily briefing. "Your experience that night could be the catalyst for real change." Morrison stared out his office window at the protesters gathering below. Their signs told the story. Even the FBI director isn't safe. Reform now, justice for all. The crowd grew larger each day, their chants echoing through the marble halls of power. Cooper's life had become a different kind of prison. Suspended without pay, he spent his days watching his career and reputation unravel on national television. His phone filled with messages, death threats mixed with support from fellow officers who saw him as a victim of political correctness. The psychological evaluation ordered by Internal Affairs revealed a man struggling with unprocessed trauma. 3 years earlier, Cooper had been first on scene at a violent carjacking that left 2 officers critically wounded. The department-mandated counseling had been cursory, a box checked rather than a wound healed. Officer Cooper displays signs of hypervigilance and threat fixation, the psychologist's report noted. His traffic stop patterns suggest an officer operating from a place of unresolved fear rather than tactical assessment. Public reactions split along predictable lines. Police unions defended Cooper, citing the dangerous nature of traffic stops and recent carjacking patterns. Civil rights organizations pointed to the incident as proof of systemic bias. Social media turned both men into symbols rather than people. But Morrison found himself walking a delicate line. His position demanded justice, but his experience gave him insight into Cooper's mindset. During a closed-door Senate hearing, he surprised everyone with his testimony. What happened that night wasn't just about one officer's mistakes, he testified. It was about a system that takes good people and teaches them to see threats instead of citizens. Officer Cooper didn't fail the system failed Officer Cooper. The department's response came in waves. First, the predictable administrative leave and internal investigation. Then, as public pressure mounted, broader changes. Mandatory psychological evaluations for all officers. Enhanced bias training. Review of all traffic stop procedures. But the personal toll continued to mount. Cooper's marriage strained under the pressure. His wife found herself followed by reporters, their children taunted at school. The thin blue line that once protected him now seemed to be drawing tighter around his neck. Morrison wasn't immune either. Every public appearance brought questions about that night. Every policy decision was viewed through the lens of his experience. His advocacy for reform strained relationships with law enforcement agencies nationwide. The investigation reached its climax 6 weeks after the incident. Internal Affairs had compiled a damning report, evidence of systematic bias, procedural violations, and departmental oversight failures. Cooper's career in law enforcement was effectively over, but the report suggested he was more symptom than cause. "We've identified serious deficiencies in our training and supervision," Chief Williams announced at a press conference. Officer Cooper's actions that night reflected institutional failures that we must address. Cooper watched the press conference from his lawyer's office, his face ashen. The man in the videos Internal Affairs had compiled seemed like a stranger, aggressive, fearful, escalating routine situations into potentially deadly confrontations. "I never saw it," he whispered, watching footage of himself drawing his weapon on a teenage driver for a broken taillight. "I never saw what I was becoming." Morrison chose that moment to take an unprecedented step. He requested a private meeting with Cooper, away from cameras and microphones. In a small conference room at the FBI field office, the 2 men faced each other for the first time since that night. "I've reviewed every second of your body camera footage," Morrison began. "I've read every complaint, every evaluation, every report. And I see something familiar, a good officer who lost his way because the system didn't give him the support he needed." Cooper struggled to meet his gaze. "I could have killed you. Yes, Morrison agreed. And then you would have been another tragedy, another officer whose life was destroyed because we didn't address the real problems in time. But we have a chance to change that now. The meeting lasted 3 hours. No attorneys, no union representatives, just two men trying to find a path forward through the wreckage of that night. When they emerged, both had a clearer vision of what needed to happen next. The department's final report was released 2 months after the incident. It recommended Cooper's termination and criminal charges, but also outlined systemic failures and proposed comprehensive reforms. The document would become a blueprint for police departments nationwide. But for Cooper and Morrison, the investigation's end marked a beginning. Each man carried scars from that night, Cooper's career destroyed, Morrison's faith in the system shaken. Yet both understood that their personal drama had exposed deeper truths about American law enforcement that could no longer be ignored. As Cooper cleared out his locker, watched by internal affairs officers, he found a note from Morrison. Sometimes it takes a good person's mistake to expose a bad system's failures. What matters now is what we learn from IT. The federal courthouse buzzed with tension as Officer Ryan Cooper's trial began. Television crews camped outside, their satellite trucks lined up like circus wagons. Inside, the wood-paneled courtroom felt suffocating as Cooper sat at the defense table, his once crisp uniform replaced by a subdued navy suit. The prosecution's case was methodical, damning. Body camera footage played on screens throughout the courtroom, showing not just the Georgetown incident, but a pattern of escalation and bias. Each video clip, each statistical analysis, each expert testimony added another brick to the wall of evidence. But it was FBI Director Morrison's testimony that captivated the nation. He took the stand on the third day, his presence commanding immediate attention. The prosecutor's questions were precise, professional. Morrison's answers, unexpected. Yes, Officer Cooper drew his weapon without proper cause, Morrison testified, his voice steady. Yes, he escalated a routine traffic stop into a potentially deadly confrontation. But we cannot separate his actions from the system that shaped them. Morrison looked directly at Cooper as he continued. What happened that night was the product of inadequate training, insufficient support, and institutional biases that we in law enforcement leadership have failed to address. Officer Cooper must be held accountable for his actions. But we must also hold ourselves accountable for creating conditions that made such actions almost inevitable. During cross-examination, Cooper's attorney tried to use Morrison's testimony to minimize his client's culpability. Morrison wouldn't allow it. Understanding the context doesn't excuse the conduct, he stated firmly. Officer Cooper made choices that night that could have had tragic consequences. He must face those consequences. But if we don't address the underlying issues, we'll be back in this courtroom with different names and the same story. Cooper's own testimony came next. Gone was the defensive posture, the attempted justifications. Weeks of reflection and therapy had stripped away his protective walls. I was afraid, he admitted, his voice barely audible. Not just that night, but every night. Every traffic stop, every interaction. The training taught us to see threats everywhere, but never taught us how to see people. I didn't even realize what I'd become until I was pointing my weapon at the FBI director. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Cooper was found guilty of civil rights violations and misconduct under color of authority. The judge, acknowledging both the seriousness of the offense and Morrison's testimony about systemic issues, sentenced him to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Mr. Cooper, the judge stated during sentencing, your actions that night revealed not just your own failures, but the failures of an entire system. Your sentence reflects both. Use this time to consider how you might be part of the solution rather than perpetuating the problem. The aftermath brought waves of change. The Department of Justice launched a comprehensive review of police training nationwide. Morrison used his position to push for reforms he'd been advocating for years, now armed with personal experience that no one could dismiss. New training protocols were implemented across the country. Psychological support for officers was enhanced. Bias recognition and de-escalation techniques became mandatory components of police academy curriculum. Body camera footage review became routine, with AI systems flagging potential pattern behavior for early intervention. Media coverage shifted from sensational to substantive. Editorial boards that had initially called for Cooper's head now wrote thoughtful pieces about the pressures facing law enforcement officers and the need for systemic change. Documentary filmmakers began following both Morrison and Cooper's stories, seeing in their intersection a powerful narrative about American justice. Cooper's first month in prison brought an unexpected visitor. Morrison sat across from him in the visitation room, both men older in different ways than they'd been that night in Georgetown. "The reforms are taking hold," Morrison told him. "Departments across the country are changing their training protocols. Your case is being used as a teaching tool not to demonize you, but to prevent others from following the same path." Cooper nodded, his prison jumpsuit a constant reminder of where that path had led him. "I think about that night every day," he said. "Not just what I did wrong, but what led me to think it was right at the time." "That's exactly what we need officers to understand," Morrison replied. "The biggest dangers aren't always the ones we can see through a car window. Sometimes they're the biases and fears we carry with us on patrol." As Cooper served his sentence, the reforms continued. Police academies began incorporating the Georgetown Protocol's training procedures specifically designed to prevent bias-motivated escalation. Departments nationwide adopted early intervention systems to identify officers showing patterns of aggressive behavior. The media noted the changes. 1 year after Georgetown, how a traffic stop changed American policing, read the Washington Post headline. "From confrontation to reform, the Morrison-Cooper effect," declared the New York Times. But for the two men at the center of it all, the resolution wasn't about headlines or policy changes. It was about understanding how good intentions could be corrupted by fear, how systems could fail both the public and those sworn to protect them, and how change often comes at a personal cost. Sometimes. Morrison would later write in his memoir, "It takes a perfect storm of mistakes to show us the way forward." What happened that night in Georgetown was such a storm. The question was never whether Officer Cooper deserved punishment. He did. And he accepted it. The question was whether we could learn from it, whether we could use one officer's fall to lift up an entire profession. I believe we have begun to do exactly that. The morning sun cast long shadows across the renovated precinct building, its fresh paint and reinforced windows a physical testament to the changes of the past year. Detective Sarah Morrison stood at her desk, surveying the bustling office floor with quiet satisfaction. The transformation went far deeper than mere cosmetics. In the wake of the Cooper case, the department had undergone a radical restructuring. Morrison's new Community First initiative, born from the hard lessons learned, had become a model for precincts across the state. Gone were the days of isolated officers and territorial divisions. In their place stood integrated teams, each one a careful balance of veteran experience and fresh perspective. The initiative's cornerstone was the mandatory mental health program, something Morrison had fought hard to implement. Every officer now had regular sessions with trained counselors, breaking down the old stigmas that had contributed to Cooper's spiral. The results spoke for themselves. Complaints were down 60%, while community engagement had reached unprecedented levels. Speaking of Cooper, Morrison glanced at the framed newspaper clipping on her wall. "Former detective finds new purpose in prison reform," the headline read. Cooper's rehabilitation had surprised many, but not her. She had visited him 3 months after sentencing, found him changed, humbled, yet purposeful. He had channeled his experience into helping other inmates confront their demons, working with prison psychiatrists to develop peer support programs. Chief Morrison, a young officer, appeared at her door, tablet in hand. "The Community Oversight Board is ready for you." Morrison nodded, gathering her papers. The board, another post-Cooper innovation, comprised civilian leaders, reform advocates, and law enforcement veterans. Together, they ensured transparency and accountability at every level of operations. It wasn't always comfortable having so many eyes on their work, but discomfort, Morrison had learned, often preceded growth. As she walked to the meeting room, Morrison reflected on the cost of change. The past year had been brutal, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about power, responsibility, and human nature. They had lost good people along the way, some who couldn't adapt, others who simply couldn't forgive themselves for not seeing the signs earlier. But they had gained something precious in return: trust, real, hard-earned trust, built on transparency and shared vulnerability. She saw it in the way civilians now approached officers on the street, in the increasing number of community members volunteering for joint initiatives, in the gradual healing of old wounds. The system wasn't perfect, probably never would be, but it was better, more human, and as Morrison pushed open the boardroom door, greeting the diverse faces gathered around the table, she knew that was enough. Sometimes the deepest wounds created the strongest bonds, and the darkest moments lit the way forward.